go. Okay, and I'm also being told that it's hard to see what's in the brown. So let me come out of this. Y'all, if you all want to just keep putting in the chat who you are. And then the second question is, were you at the first session up under the anti-racism umbrella, which was on microaggressions? And I will quickly fix my slides so that you can see them better, hopefully. Okay, sorry about that. I was trying to change the color on my slide, and I was trying to figure out how to just change all of them, but I can't. So I'm probably just going to have to go through and do them one at a time, which is taking way longer than I wanted it to. So I apologize for that. I just want to make sure that you all are able to actually see the slide. So try change. See, I should have just asked in the chat. Let's see. It says try changing the theme. And theme is under, you would think I'd be a little more savvy as many presentations as I've done. Let's see where I can find theme at. Oh, there it is. Thank you. Okay, we're going to do nothing fancy, and we're going to hope that this will work. I think we got it. Thank you to the chat. All right, let's share the screen again. And this should be better for you to see. There we go. All right, sorry about that, everyone. Let me open the chat back up. Okay, let's see who we have here. So it looks like we have some parents, which is great because this is the Parent Institute. We do have a couple of staff members, so that is great. Thank you for joining us. Let's see what else. Looks like we have a person, parent and teacher and community member. Great. Looks like most folks were not at the first session. Oh, here's a couple people that were. And just so you know, if you did miss the first session, we did record it, just like we're recording this one. And if you go to the Parent Institute page on our website, you'll be able to watch the recording. So great. Thank you for being here. All right. So what are our goals for this evening? We have several goals. One is to be able to define what implicit bias is, and we'll talk about the difference between implicit and explicit bias. Another goal is to understand the impact that implicit bias has on our students and other people in your life, and specifically on our students of color. Although implicit bias can happen among a variety of identities, because this fits up under our anti-racism work, we will be focused on race and ethnicity. And then talk about some strategies that you can use in being more aware of your implicit bias so that you can address those biases because they can be addressed. All right, so I always like to start off talking about courageous conversations because often when we're talking about race, racism, microaggressions, bias, it can be uncomfortable for folks, and we want to make sure that people stay engaged in the conversation. So the first thing is to stay engaged. Take notes. Again, I'd encourage you, if you haven't already done so, to grab some paper and something to write with. Feel free to ask questions. I do have the chat open. And also feel free to reflect in the chat. And I'm the only person that can see the chat. And I will not say folks' names. I'll just say we have someone in the chat who has shared with us, and I'll share. So I would encourage you to write notes, and those things that you feel comfortable sharing, I'd encourage you to put those in the chat. The next one is to speak your truth. So this is really about owning your own experiences, using I statements, not speaking in general terms, and not speaking for other people. Our third one is to experience discomfort. As I stated before, these conversations can be uncomfortable, and that is okay. We will survive and get through this together. So that will work. We will process together. Looks like folks are still typing in the chat. Let's see. Oh, okay. All right, I have updated the chat. So now I think I am the only person who will see the chat. Yes, okay, it's been updated. Thank you. The next one is to own intent versus impact. So sometimes we can say something that maybe hurts someone's feelings or offends them, and our natural reaction can be to say, I didn't mean it that way, or you took it the wrong way. And so what that does is dismiss the impact that words and actions have on people. And so we need to be able to sit with the impact that we've had on people. It is always less about the intent and more about the impact. So I would challenge us to think about that this evening. And then the last one is to expect and accept non-closure. We're not together for a terribly long time, and we could talk for hours on implicit bias and what that means and its impacts. And so it's okay to walk away and still have questions, to still have concerns. We will have other opportunities to engage with you all, or you can always feel free to reach out to me and we can continue the discussion. So we're going to watch a video, and this is about understanding implicit bias. And Kerwin Institute, which is at the Ohio State University, has put together a new set of implicit bias modules. And this is one from some K-12 work that they did last year, but I think it's very applicable to our conversation today. So I'm going to share that with you. As we watch this short video, I want you to think about something that surprises you, something that resonates with you, and a new realization or new perspective that you have in watching this video. So again, I'll encourage you to take notes and to feel free to put reflections and or questions in the chat.
This first lesson will provide the foundational understanding of how we define implicit bias and why it matters for our pursuit of diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice. During this module, when we talk about implicit bias, we're referring to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. Let's start to unpack that a little bit. Although it's often used in a negative context, the word bias simply means an evaluation or belief. That means it's possible to have a bias that is favorable or unfavorable. In other words, you can have a bias towards an object, person, or concept that is positive or negative. Bias in and of itself is a neutral term. For example, take these three colors. I could say that I am biased towards red or biased against blue, or maybe I'm neutral towards yellow, and all of those statements could be true. And most people would agree that my preferences for red over yellow or blue don't make me a bad person. They are simply my preferences, and I probably did nothing to consciously control these preferences myself. So, when we say that our psychological processes are implicit or unconscious, we're simply referring to something operating outside of our conscious awareness. Like bias, the term implicit in and of itself isn't a good or bad thing. In fact, as you will learn later in this training, we rely on implicit processes to move efficiently throughout the world. So, by definition, implicit bias is nothing more than our evaluations or beliefs, whether positive or negative, that can exist without us even realizing it. So, if it's true that our biases may be hidden to us and they aren't necessarily bad, why are we talking about them? Well, we're talking about them because we now know that it's possible for us to form implicit evaluations based on inaccurate information or stereotypes of people, objects, and ideas. There's also evidence that implicit biases can impact our decisions, perceptions, and behaviors. This makes it more difficult for us to live up to our values of equity and fairness. That means that the actions and decisions resulting from our implicit biases can create real world barriers to equity and opportunity. You'll learn more about what the research says about the effects of bias later on in these modules. But these practical applications are why it's so important to learn about implicit bias, particularly those biases that don't align with your intentions or explicit beliefs. To summarize, implicit bias refers to attitudes or stereotypes we hold outside of our conscious awareness. Implicit bias does not refer to those beliefs we are aware of, but that we conceal or suppress in an effort to appear non biased. The word attitude describes your evaluation of some concept like a person, place, thing, or idea. For instance, in the color example from earlier, I shared that I prefer red. Attitudes can be positive or negative. In this example, my evaluation of red is positive. Alternatively, my evaluation of blue is negative. We use the word stereotype to refer to those beliefs that are mentally associated with a given category. For example, people often stereotype Asians as being good at math, and men are associated with being in the workplace more often than women are. Even if we don't endorse these stereotypes, they can unintentionally influence our mental processes. At this point, you might be asking yourself, why is the topic of implicit bias worth our consideration when there are so many other issues that can impact our pursuit of equity and fairness? Implicit bias is just another tool we possess to understand how our conscious commitments to fairness and equity can be disrupted, even when people have the best intentions. More importantly, considering implicit bias doesn't take away from the importance of addressing explicit or direct instances of discrimination. In fact, the effects of implicit, explicit, and institutional bias are informed by and contribute to each other. Although the main focus of these modules will be on implicit bias, we will also incorporate information and resources related to institutional and overt forms of bias.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to go to the chat. I'm going to encourage you to put something in the chat either that surprised you about that video, something that maybe resonated with you, or if you had a new realization or new perspective. I'm going to give you a minute to share. All right, someone in the chat said they hadn't really thought about biases that are good. Yes, so we can have, well, not good. Okay, I see what they're saying. So this idea that if you have a bias, it must be a bad thing, not necessarily true, right? Like she talked about her color bias, and that's not good or bad. It's just that she prefers one color over another. Someone else said biases are innately good or bad. Um, yes, I automatically assumed that biases meant negative and never thought about positive. Yes. Resonated with me that we can disrupt our negative biases towards people or groups. One way is to spend intentional time around groups we're not familiar with. Yes. And we're going to talk about some other ways that you can interrupt those implicit biases. Someone said, I like that bias is defined as neutral, which helps prevent a judgment with the discussion and reflection. Yes. And that is something that we've been talking a lot about with staff as we've been doing this work. Really trying to get away from the judgment piece of these conversations around anti racism, and this one specifically around implicit bias, so that we can just do the work of getting better, right? And so this is not a judgment. We all have implicit bias. Some of those are more positive than other ones, but really removing ourselves from that judgment piece allows us to focus on what those implicit biases might be and to make some improvements on those. So thank you all for sharing in the chat. Appreciate that. All right, so she talked about explicit bias, implicit bias, and institutional bias. Oh, one more thing in the chat. Resonates with me that biases are created by the exposures we encounter and live with day to day. Yes. And for those of you that were on the microaggression session, one of the things I shared was, yes, this is about learning new things, but this is also about unlearning things that we might have learned that we now know are not good. And so that is the same thing when we think about implicit bias. Biases are created by exposures we have, right? So that means we can create new ways of thinking by having different exposures. And we'll talk about that as we get towards the end of the presentation. Thank you all. All right, so explicit bias. We're all aware of explicit bias, right? It's a conscious awareness. It's usually rooted in some type of rationalized past experience we've had, and then it's expressed through deliberate comments or behaviors. And sometimes that intent can be to harm, dominate, or marginalize other people, right? So, like when you hear a racist slur or term, that is explicit, right? Um, I always use the example of how I feel about some animals over another. If you've spent a lot of time with me, you probably know that I have a bias towards dogs over cats, and that sometimes I can verbalize how I truly feel about cats, which I won't say right now since I'm being recorded. But that is an explicit bias that I'm clear that I have. As opposed to when we think about implicit bias, so these happen in an unconscious manner, right? Automatically activated, usually without conscious thought, may be in conflict with what we say we believe and value, right? Especially as we think about groups of people and identities. Influenced by past experiences and tend to reflect perceived societal values. So, again, this exposure to our lived experiences and biases may be held against individuals in one or more identity groups. So that is one of the reasons why we're having this conversation, because we can talk about implicit bias that happens against folks of color. Impacts decision making, can be harmful to others, especially when we're not aware of those biases. As we're navigating through our work world and thinking about how we interact with people and how those implicit bias might show up. And then not intentional, but can still have a significant and negative impact. So, for example, maybe a teacher who only calls on a certain group of students. Maybe the teacher only calls on the boys in the class, rarely calls on girls, right? Or perhaps there's a parent who only buys their child a certain type of doll. So maybe they only buy their child white dolls, right? And so maybe they're not explicitly saying how they feel about either of those situations, but something in them is causing them to make those decisions. Okay. All right. So we're going to watch one more little short video, and this one is on the origins of our bias. And so for this one, what I'd like you to think about is your own life experiences. And we've already had a couple people talk about how our life experiences impact our implicit bias. But think about which aspects of your formative experiences influence associations you might still hold today as an adult. And then think about how those associations impact your decision making and interactions with other people. Right. See here.
Hi, I'm Lena Tenney, Coordinator of Public Engagement for the Race and Cognition Program at the Kirwan Institute. So far, we have talked a lot about what implicit bias is and how it operates. Now we will share some information about the origins of our biases. To do so, we will discuss different perspectives on how we internalize the messages in our environment as implicit associations or biases. Our brain's ability to make connection between two concepts is known as associative learning. The best example of how our minds do this is through the process of classical conditioning. Most of you may have seen or heard about the original classical conditioning study conducted with the scientist Pavlov and his dogs. Every time Pavlov gave his dogs food, they began to salivate. This was their automatic response. Then he rang a bell every time he presented the food to the animals. Over time, after seeing these two stimuli paired together repeatedly, the dogs eventually exhibited the physiological response of salivating when a bell was rung, even when there was no food around. The association was formed. Even though this classic study uses the examples of animal behavior, we all do the same thing when our brains try to perceive and categorize people. So in the same way that the dogs associated the bell with food, we associate characteristics such as leadership or criminality with aspects of people's identity, like gender or race. For example, because CEOs of large companies have historically been older white men, this may be the first image that comes into our mind when we think of someone in this role. One of the most interesting things about this style of learning is that people internalize associations at a young age, and it's our childhood experiences that ingrain them in our minds. So even if we hold beliefs that value equity and fair treatment, we can still be implicitly influenced by those messages we already received. I'm a perfect example of that. People who know me are always surprised to learn that I have a strong implicit association connecting women with being at home and men being in the workplace. In my life, this association is pretty ironic. Here I am, a genderqueer person in the workforce who believes very strongly that people of all genders should be able to pursue their dreams. And yet, I still hold this strong association that directly opposes my own values and self-interest. But I know this association didn't appear out of nowhere. My own family experience reflected this dynamic. My mother was an incredible stay-at-home mom who cared for 6 children, and my father served in the Air Force. I don't think I really knew any women who worked outside of the home, other than my teachers, until middle school. Because of this early experience, it's no surprise that I still unconsciously associate women with family and men with careers. But since I know about the implicit associations I hold, I can be mindful of my biases or inclinations and intentionally try to stop them. For example, if I am part of a hiring committee for a job, I need to be aware of the possibility that my implicit associations might cause me to more harshly evaluate candidates who are women, while giving the benefit of the doubt to candidates who are men. With this awareness, I am actually able to start behaving in ways to address my biases.
Okay. So again, the reflect and respond prompts for this video are thinking about your own life experiences and which experiences have you had that you think influence associations that you still hold today. And then thinking about how those associations might impact your decision making and interactions with other people. So I'll give you a minute or two to think about that and to hopefully share something in the chat. Okay, let's see. Oh, you all are being shy on this one. Anyone want to share a life experience that you think is still impacting you and your associations that you have with people or certain identities? Oh, here we go. Okay. All right. So this person says that being raised by women and only one patriarch in my family, the idea of staying home to raise a family was foreign to me. I tend to judge women who do so harshly because they don't face the professional experiences working women do because they are home. That is a great example, right? So this person is saying that they grew up seeing women who work. And so when they come in contact with women who don't, they're recognizing that they have some judgment towards those women. Thank you for sharing. Another person is saying that their own experiences with their parents and friends' parents, they associate their dads with coaches and their moms as cheerleader. They said it impacts me because, oh, sorry, someone else is typing, because I have to be cautious with asking student athletes if they practice with their dad. It takes me more energy to be thoughtful with this conversation. Yes, that energy is really important. Taking that moment to pause, especially when we're aware, when we've done some thinking about an implicit bias that we have, taking that moment to pause before we engage in conversations is a great tool. And then one more says, growing up in a predominantly small farm town, I fit in with the mass majority of the race. However, knowing this and my experience in HR and knowledge of what I wanted in a house drew me to the Franklin Park Area Association. I thrived in the culture opposite of what I was raised because I knew of this bias. That's great. And then someone else shared it takes energy and discipline to check yourself. Yes, it does. It takes a lot of work. Oh, okay, let's share this last one. Someone said, society's view of beauty, the lack of exposure as a young child and through teenage years of women who look like me that are considered beautiful, brown skin, thick hair, continues to make me second guess the place of beauty brown women have in society. Yes. So, this person is saying they identify as a brown person and they still hold an implicit bias against an identity that is of their own. And that is very true for a lot of folks when you have marginalized identities. Thank you so much for sharing that. And then someone said, I was never around same sex couples or even families without parents. I have to be mindful when asking my students questions, assuming they have parents or even a mother and father. Yes, and that's one of the things we're going to talk about. You all are nailing this. Let's see. Someone said, don't second guess yourself. You are beautiful. Yes. And those reaffirming words are great. And we still have those voices in our head, right? If you've grown up, if you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s, and you have seen pretty much one image of what beauty is. Now, I will say that that has begun to shift, but it's still not the majority of what we see. It's really hard to unlearn those things. Thank you all so much. You all shared a lot of great things. Thank you. All right, so things to remember. Implicit bias operates outside of our conscious awareness, right? So we have to remember that because it's not easy to find what our implicit biases are. Implicit bias is unconscious, automatic, and relies on associations that we formed over time. And some of you have shared some of those associations that you form. We can form bias towards groups of people based on what we see in the media, our own background, and our experiences. And then our biases reflect how we internalize messages about our society rather than our intent. Nevertheless, we can still act on our biases in ways that can harm others. And so that's why this work is so important, because our implicit bias can harm other people. All right, so what are some of the implications of unconscious bias? You talked about in the chat, but I wanted to make sure that I at least mention these because I think it's really important as you think about navigating in our Bexley community and thinking about how we can be better community members no matter the role that we play. So the first one, of course, is racial stereotypes, which is what we've been talking a lot about. And so there can be this automatic preference for one race over another without even being aware of the bias. So the bias can manifest itself in small kind of like interpersonal ways, interpersonal interactions, but it has broader implications when we think about things like the legal system, our health system, and many other important sectors of society. The next one on here is gender stereotypes. And so the person in the last video talked about some of the gender stereotypes that they have, but this way in which we judge men, women, perhaps non-binary folks based on what traditional roles we think they should play. So a lot of times we have this implicit bias of women as feminine and men as masculine. And when folks don't fit into those categories, we have some judgment towards that. The next one is our healthcare system. And as I'm sure a lot of you already know, racial and ethnic minorities and women can be subject to less and worse clinical outcomes when it comes to getting their health needs addressed. Additionally, Black children are often not treated as children at all, or not given the same level of compassion or care as white children. And there's been a lot of research done around this. Someone talked about heterosexual relationships, or not even seeing thinking about homes that might not have two parents. So LGBTQ plus bias is another one. And a simple example could be, if one of your female friends shares that she has a date and you say to her, oh, wow, that's great. What's his name, right? And so not even thinking, no bad intent behind it, but just kind of what we go to because it's probably what's been ingrained in us, what we've seen as the norm, and how we've grown up. The legal system, which I'm sure you all know, especially with all that's going on in our country right now, there's a lot of information out there on shooter bias and this tendency among the police specifically to shoot Black civilians more often than white civilians, even when they're unarmed. So that implicit bias and having to think quickly and make decisions in law enforcement. And then work. So there was an experiment done that tracked the success of white and Black job applicants, and they found that stereotypically white names, the assumption that the resume was white received 50% more callbacks than stereotypical Black names, regardless of the industry or occupation. And again, the person in the last video talked about how you have to be cognizant of these biases because it can impact other people. And so for those of us who might sit in on hiring practices, this would be something really important to think about. And then the last one, of course, is school. So when we think about discipline, special education, gifted and talented programs, teacher mindsets and beliefs, and how that plays out in the day-to-day classroom, tracking, all of those things can impact how we do our jobs, right, in education. So we have to be really mindful of those things. And those are conversations that we're also having in the school. Let's see, looking at the chat. Social media can kill implicit bias. Wow. Yeah, because we are starting to see more variety of people, right, in social media. So we can say that sometimes it can be used for good things. Oh, being raised by grandparents, yes. So not making assumptions as you're interacting with kids about what their home life situation might be. Let's see. Someone said, this is so interesting because I'm white but have a more stereotypical Black name, and I do notice a difference. Yes, I can remember growing up and telling my mother, why didn't you just name me Sue? Like something simple. People might assume something different about me. So names can really bring out bias in people. Oh, yes. And someone said we cannot forget religious bias. Yes, that's another one. And I'm sure we could add to this list. I just wanted to make sure that I hit some of these. All right. So we've talked a lot about how the bias shows up, what it can look like, the origins of bias. So let's think about how we can challenge the implicit bias that we have. So the first thing is that you become aware of your biases so that you can interrupt them. Again, the difference between implicit and explicit is that implicit bias is unconscious. So you have to do the work to become more aware of those things that you have biases towards. As someone shared in the chat earlier, perhaps it's about, you know, let's say you're going to interact with someone who you know triggers some biases in you. So maybe you take a 5-10 second pause to ask yourself about those biases towards that person and think about how you can disrupt those and not necessarily always be on autopilot, which I think is what happens for a lot of us. We're on autopilot, we're reacting, and we're not necessarily taking that time to pause and think about the interactions that we're having with other people. The next one is study and engage others in conversations about implicit bias. Listening helps us take in a person's multiple stories, and it helps to disrupt biased thinking. Also, when we engage in conversations with other people, it can help us learn what our own implicit bias is, right? Because a lot of times we're not aware. So if we go back to the example I gave about a teacher perhaps only calling on the boys in the class. So we have instructional coaches in our district. So an instructional coach is in the classroom. The teacher has invited them in to help them kind of tweak what they're doing. And as part of the feedback, the instructional coach might say, you know, do you notice that you usually only call on the boys in your classroom, right? And so that teacher may not have even been aware that that's what they were doing, right? So we have to be open to studying our biases and to engaging in these conversations so that we can kind of unearth what our implicit biases are. The next one is about tone policing. I have a definition for what it is. So tone policing is when marginalized people speak up about their struggles and people from a more dominant group focus not on what was said, but how it was said. And so when you're trying to challenge implicit bias, so let's go back to the classroom example. Let's say that the teacher is a white teacher and the instructional coach says to the teacher, the instructional coach happens to be an African-American person. And they say to the teacher, you know, do you realize you only call on the white boys in your classroom? instead of taking in that valuable feedback, tone policing would be the way in which the feedback is given. And so taking the focus off of what was said and getting caught up in how it was said. Now, the classroom example was probably not the best example, because usually when tone policing happens is when it has happened to that person, when the implicit bias or the racist comment has happened to that person and they're reacting. And if that has happened to you, there's a good chance that your reaction might be emotional. It might not be stated in the nicest way, right? But we still have to be open to taking in that feedback and not get so caught up in how the feedback is given to us. We need to listen to the voices of the folks in our lives, our colleagues, our students, our friends, our families, who have been the victims of the bias or the racism, so that we can be more aware and do better. Tune into implicit bias in your community by asking yourself these questions. So the first one is, where do I see implicit biases playing out in my community? The next one would be, what fear or apprehension do I have about addressing the issue? And the last one would be, how can I be an ally to friends, colleagues, students, and families who experience bias in our community? So again, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to look at those questions, think about those questions, and give some thoughts in the chat. Okay, it looks like we've had someone share that they can see implicit bias in our students with special needs. Okay, even when exceptionally gifted, they are often overlooked or seen as a burden in the classroom because of their IEP. So when we think about the stereotypes that we might have around what it means to be um, a special education student, right? That can play out in not acknowledging that you can have an IEP and also be exceptionally gifted, right? And so that can play out in our school district. That is a good example. Thank you. Oh, someone shared above that, I almost missed this, about, oh, they're talking about this idea of tone policing. So they are talking about being lectured for their tone of questioning an executive at their job. But when the same person asked questions almost far more direct and assertive, because she was white, this person who's Black was considered, the white person's comments were considered acceptable, and this person's comments were considered coming from an angry Black woman. Yes. And so that's another reason why allyship is so important, because often those stereotypes show up for people and we need other people to help call those out. Someone says, I see implicit bias in the schools. I have fears that if I address these issues with too much force, my son will face the backlash from both staff and other parents. Okay. I would encourage you to speak to someone. I don't know if you can see me, but I'm pointing at myself. because we want to make sure that these issues are addressed, and we want to make sure they're addressed the right way, because at the end of the day, it is about supporting our students. Someone else said, I see them playing out in schools and law enforcement. As a minority, my fear is that my voice is not heard, and instead of being viewed as someone trying to fix the problem, I'm looking to create the problem. I can listen to others and offer support in addressing the problem. Strength in numbers. Yes, yes. So there's a theme happening here with a couple folks around this fear, right? This fear of speaking up, of speaking out, even around a bias, right? So we're not even necessarily talking about all out racism. We're talking about addressing implicit bias. And there's fear for some folks. And most of the folks who have the fear are folks who have a marginalized identity. So these folks happen to be folks of color who are sharing this. And so really thinking about the impact that biases have on people of color is really important. Someone said, in my experience, the work to overcome implicit biases can take constant vigilance at first, but becomes more natural over time. Yes, it's one of those things you have to practice and be aware of. Sometimes when I'm in conversation, I will just say, I know that my bias is this. So let me think about this for a moment before I react. Like just naming it out loud and kind of normalizing that kind of out loud work, I think really helps to create a different kind of culture around how we engage around our own biases. I have experienced leaders calling women moody instead of assertive in all types of situations. Yes, yes, been there, had that happen. I see implicit bias in the ways we attract students of color with sharing skills and talents in our school system. We provide Eurocentric options and values towards certain honors. Yes, because that is what we know, right? That is probably what most of us have grown up and learned. That is the system that we have had in place. So that is our go-to, that is our natural reaction, our bias. So really trying to think outside of that box and offer other opportunities for all of our students. The last comment resonates with me. Fear that there will be backlash for a child. I had a fear like that around addressing bullying. Yes. And I think that that fear is real, um, and it's understandable. And I would hope that we have people and mechanisms in place where those things can be shared. For example, I work a lot with the Bexley Minority Parent Alliance, and they will often tell parents to call me, and I will have conversations to help address issues. And I like to say that I've been doing that in a way that helps to minimize some of that backlash. So I know a lot of that is also about relationship building and building that trust so that we can address what those issues are. Let's see. I don't have any experiences outside of these options and am fearful for what solutions to bring to the table. So this is a good point. So this person is acknowledging that they don't have experiences as an educator outside of kind of this Eurocentric view of things. And so there is some fear there about what solutions they can bring to the table. And so I want us to think about that as we think about, let me see which slide it is. As we think about ways that we can change our implicit associations. I want us to think about that comment. Thank you all for these wonderful comments. Really appreciate it. All right, so changing implicit association. If you haven't heard of the Harvard Implicit Association Test, I would encourage you to Google Harvard IAT. It will come up. There are several IATs on there. So I think race, gender, I think there's something on there currently that has to do with the presidential race. There are quite a few, but it really helps you think about, it really gives you a tool on what your biases might be. And I think you might be surprised at some of the information you get, but it helps to identify those things that you may not be able to see. So that's one way. Let's see, research suggests that this conscious awareness of one's own implicit bias is a critical first step for counteracting the influence, which we've talked about. And it'll also enable you to become consciously aware of some of the unconscious associations that you may harbor. The other way that you can help to change some of your implicit associations is through intergroup contact. So, meaningful engagement with individuals whose identities differ from your own, right? So, whether that be race, ethnicity, religion, really take some time to think about the people that you interact with on a day-to-day basis. And not necessarily your coworkers, but maybe when we were able to go out and do more, what you do on the weekend, the groups that maybe you're associated with, if you're affiliated with a religious organization, if you have children and they're in certain play groups or take lessons at different places, what do those people look like? Are they the same as you? Do they have the same race, the same ethnicity, the same religion? And how can you diversify that so that you can diversify your thoughts and hopefully help break down some unconscious stereotypes that you might have about certain groups of people? Um, Also keep in mind that certain conditions must exist in order for this to work, right? So if there's like a power dynamic there, let's say you're a white person and the person that you're trying to intermingle with is a person of color, but maybe you supervise that person, right? There's a power dynamic there. So you just have to be aware of those types of things. The last one is exposure to counter stereotypical exemplars. And what that means is individuals who contradict widely held stereotypes. So, studies have shown that exposure to these exemplars may help individuals begin to automatically override their pre existing biases. So, when we think about some of those stereotypes, it could be that you're around male nurses, right? Because usually when we think about nurses, we think about women, or female scientists, right? African American judges, because we don't normally see a lot of African American judges, but engaging in ways that defy some of those stereotypes. Yes, someone put in the chat, male teachers, right? We do not have a lot of male teachers. So you can't see the bottom of this, but I just said everything that's on the screen. So, can't do a presentation in a K-12 school district and not talk about bias and our children. So, research tells us that between the ages of 2 and 5, children become aware of differences as it relates to gender, race, ethnicity, disabilities. Young children not only recognize differences, they also absorb which differences are positive and which are not, attached to aspects of identity by their family and by society in general, right? So they pick up on our own biases, the biases of adults. Young children develop prejudice, misconceptions, discomfort, fear, and rejection of differences that may develop into real prejudice if parents and teachers do not intervene, right? And so we can't have this assumption that 2, 3, 4, 5-year-olds, as sweet and cute as they may be, that they aren't picking up on these biases, right? I know that we might prefer to believe that young children are blissfully unaware of our differences, but they can pick up on these differences and begin to formulate their own prejudice and discrimination based on these differences, which is why it has to be addressed at a young age. So, what can parents, caretakers, adults do? First is we can create an environment at home or at school that deliberately contrasts the prevailing biased messages of the wider society, right? So think again, like I asked you to think about the people that you surround yourself with, right? Take a look around your environment, your home. I think 2 years ago, we asked our staff to do like an audit of their classroom, to look at the pictures on the wall, to look at the books that they had, to think about the speakers that were coming in, to see if they represented multiple identities and not just the same kind of status quo. Provide books, dolls, toys, wall decorations, TV programs, and records that reflect diverse images that children may not see elsewhere. And this is important not just for families of color, but especially important for white families also, for those children and students to be able to see other people that don't necessarily look like. And so some of the ways this might play out is, again, those non-stereotypical gender roles, racial and cultural backgrounds, showing people of color in leadership. That's really important. Capabilities, so showing people that might have different disabilities, and then family structures, which we talked about earlier. So maybe it's moms, maybe it's a grandmother, maybe it's a single parent home, but really thinking about ways that that can show up. And books are an excellent way to get that into your home. There are so many amazing, diverse books out there now that I don't think that most of us had access to as we were growing up. We have a great partnership with Harper's Corner, which, if you're not familiar with them, I encourage you to Google them. But they are really working to build awareness and education around diversity and inclusion. And they've done this by donating age appropriate children's books to community elementary schools and libraries. And our 3 elementary schools were the benefactor of some of those great books. So books are definitely a great way. And I think dolls and toys too, right? Because there used to be a time when most of the dolls and toys we saw were white, right? And I know that there can be the tendency for white parents to only buy white dolls and toys for their kids. But I would encourage you to think about how you can diversify maybe what your child's toys and dolls look like. So I just talked about all of this. All right, and then the next one says, show that you value diversity in the friends you choose and in the people and places you choose for various services, which is just what I asked you to do a few minutes ago, to think about the people and places you interact with, right? Are all of your doctors white, or are they all males perhaps? What about your dentist, car mechanic, teachers? That's something that we've been having a lot of conversation about in our own district. We're very aware that the majority of our teachers are white, and it would be great not only for our white students to see teachers of color, but it would be a great experience for our students of color to also have the opportunity to have teachers of color. Remember that what you do is as important as what you say, right? And so while you might be touting how important diversity is, and touting how important it is to address your biases, does that reflect what is actually showing up in your world and in your life? So I would challenge you to think about that. And then make it a rule that a person's identity is never an acceptable reason for teasing or rejecting them, right? Like that's something we can teach our kids. Immediately step in if you hear or see your child engage in such behavior. Make it clear that you disapprove, but don't make your child feel rejected, right? This is a teachable moment with our kids, and we're trying to model the same thing here in the school district. All right, so something else to remember. While implicit biases can affect any moment of decision making, these unconscious associations should not be regarded as character flaws or other indicators of whether someone is a good person or not, right? We all have implicit biases, and that's fine. The goal is to really be cognizant about what those are so that we can do better and be better, right? And so this is not about being a bad person or a good person. It's about acknowledging them so we can decrease the actual impact that they have on specific groups of people. Right. So we are coming to the end. I do want to give you an opportunity to ask any other questions you might have, or to do any other reflecting that you might have in the chat. Also wanted to let you know, again, this is the second part of the third, or of a 3-part series on anti-racism. The third one has actually been moved. So the new date is November 11th, and it will be on understanding privilege. And then we also had one on October 18th, which was a college panel conversation, especially if you have middle school and high school students. If you missed this, I would really encourage you to, again, go on the website and watch the recording. It was about facilitating conversation and connections between Bexley families of color and leaders of color in college admissions. And it was a really good conversation. So again, you can check out our website for more information and the recordings of sessions that you might have missed. If you need my contact information, it is there, but I have a feeling that most of you know how to find me. So I will go back to questions and reflections that people might have. Someone said, I am grateful for these opportunities to learn and grow. Oh, thank you for your facilitation. Well, thank you for being here. I appreciate it. I know the beginning was a little, well, it was a hot mess, but we got through it, and I appreciate your patience. And once I got over the unnerving of that, I think we were good to go. Yeah, so again, hopefully you've enjoyed the evening and you are left with a couple things to think about. Maybe some things you might do differently. Someone said, this has been really informative. Appreciate your time. So glad to be living as a foster parent. I think my kids through the diversity, of all types at a very young age. Yes. Someone else said, someone said I have a Black woman as a pediatrician, my family doctor, and family doctor, an Indian American as my dentist. Always look at wedding photos and college photos on social media to see how many friends of color are in people's circles. And it always surprises me that the most liberal people I know have so few friends of color in their inner circles, sadly. Right. So again, does what you're saying match your reality, right? And sometimes that might take work. With white people being the majority, it is easy for you to go to a place and be surrounded by people that look like you, right? As a Black woman, most of the time, when I go to a space, I am in the minority, right? And so, as a white person, as you're thinking about how do you change your circle, that's going to take some work, right? Especially if we're talking about here in the lovely city of Bexley, or the Bexley bubble, as it's sometimes referred to. You're going to have to do some work to get out and interact with different types of people. All right, looks like we got another thank you. Yes. So again, hopefully you found a nugget or two in this conversation. I hope that you've enjoyed this evening. I know I've enjoyed it. I'm always a little nervous about how this will go with like having to have these conversations through chat, but y'all have been great. And you have shared some wonderful things in the chat, which has been amazing. So I really appreciate the conversation. Again, I encourage you to check out the Parent Institute on page on our website. And if there are sessions that you missed, you can watch those. And hopefully you are able to join us in November. So I will stay on for another minute or two to make sure there's no other questions in the chat. And I appreciate y'all. Have a good evening. Thank you, everyone.